So this workshop is going to be something very, very basic. It is just a very basic, bare bones introduction to AP judging, the way you think about the very basic fundamentals of judging principles, how to approach AP, how to get better. And at the end of the session, I'm just going to do a live OA, like off the top of one of my old UADC rounds, so that you guys have a sort of grasp on what is hopefully a good example of a major level breaking 3v3 OA or AP OA. Yeah. So here are the slides. I think I've also given them to Orcom, so I can share it to you. Again, I would just like to caveat this by saying that this is a workshop meant for mostly judges who are novices or who are beginning. Though if you are relatively, I would say if you're experienced in judging, you've got quite a fair few, and you're still here, I think it's still a good job to brush up on your fundamentals, think about how you look at burdens, metrics, and all that jazz. And then yeah, we're just gonna do that. And then obviously later I'm gonna answer some questions that was given in the form. All right. So this will just be about basic judging fundamentals, specifically in 3v3. But I would note that a lot of these concepts can also be applied to any other parliamentary format, whether or not you're judging WSDC, whether or not you're judging BP, or even other niche formats like APDA, which we won't talk about in this one. Okay, so judging. The way to think about what is judging specifically is that every team in the debate is all aiming to win. Like that's the whole point of debating, right? And they win based on forwarding something that is either convinces you that it's a good idea to propose the motion, or a bad idea to propose the motion, or like we should probably oppose that motion. And the way you think about judging is that you're basically the dude standing there thinking about the two teams when they're yapping to you, which team is being more persuasive to you with respect to the burdens on their side, with respect to the burdens within the motion that is constrained to them within the rules of BP debating. So your team can be persuasive by convincing you of a particular point to be true, but if this point doesn't relate to the motion in itself, then it's probably not going to be that important. So the basic fundamental idea of who a judge is you're just assessing the persuasiveness of speeches according to a set shared of judging criteria, rather than your own views about the subject matter. And that leads very nicely into the most important concept of judging, which is the concept of the average reasonable voter. If you want to know more about the principle of an average reasonable voter, I suggest that I will give some resources. You can either read the UADC judging handbook or the WADC BP judging manual. But every single parliamentary debating format has a very deep detail on the concept of an average reasonable voter. The average reasonable voter is basically the persona that you take on when you judge. It is the expected person that you are supposed to be when you judge any rule. And the reason this is important is because all of us humans are biased in any way possible. Maybe we have different views that are shaped on the experiences we have, etc. But as a judge, you're sort of expected to drop this. You're not expected to, not drop it and not let it influence you, because the decision you make when you judge should not be influenced by anything external. So, but at the same time, you should still be relatively someone who is, competent and smart. So it's characterized broadly in 4 ways, but again, if you want to have a bigger, deeper delve on the principle of an average reasonable voter, I suggest you take a read through the manual, which I'll give a bit later. You're basically a smart person who has a good deal of knowledge that is broad rather than deep. So you know basic facts about the world. You know things like, the United States is a democracy, and so is most country in Western Europe. You also likely know that North Korea is a dictatorship. You probably know that the CCP is a one-party authoritarian dictatorship as well. Very basic, obvious facts that you should know about the world. And you should also be aware of basic headlines of major events in the world. things like you are aware that the Ukraine-Russian conflict is happening right now, but the nuance here is that you are only aware of the basic things that are happening in the world because it's just assumed that, hey, you just know these things, but you're not the deep person of these things. I think the concept of this broad understanding but not deep understanding of the world is important because it showcases that you're expected to be a person entering a debate as someone who understands basic, intuitive, empirical facts about the world. That is to say, if someone tells you that the sky is blue, or if someone tells you that China is a dictatorship, you believe them because that's obvious, true fact. But it's not. But you're not expected to know this to a deep level. I.e., if someone tells you that China is going through an economic crisis, you don't specifically believe that first glance unless they give some degree of proof to that happening. Because I can counter assert China isn't going through an economic crisis right now, but as an average reasonable voter, you shouldn't be expected to know whether they are going through or they're not going through. And the TLDR and the bottom line to all of this is that you're basically open to sort of being persuaded about things that you may not know in deeper, and that's the job of debaters. You're just the middle person. And that leads nicely to point number 2 here, which is that you don't have preformed views about the topic of the debate. I think all debaters tend to be leaning on the liberal side of things, but you should be very open-minded and not accept things which are not accept arguments just because they're intuitively like quite, good. Like we should probably have like immigration policies that favor currently suffering immigrants, or we should probably have benefit minorities. Like these are things which are good and objectively sound good, and they are good, but you shouldn't, just because you have a preconceived belief about X being good does not mean that that is the viewpoint that you follow on when you judge a debate. I think when you judge a debate, you should be very much in the middle and very much open. That is to say, you have to pretend that you're not actually, you have to pretend that you're coming into this purely as like a jury. Like you have no idea what's going on. You have no particular belief, no particular bias. And this gives you the position of being able to be convinced on both sides. And this extends to when you look at emotion, don't think of it as, this is so gov-weighted. Because if you start looking at emotion and you think it's gov-weighted, you're going to subconsciously think that gov is weighted, which means you'll give the argument to gov more likely. I think the way you implement point number 2 specifically is, specifically in debating, and the simplest way is when you look at emotion, just throw away any case you may have or any spec knowledge you may have, because it is unlikely that the debater themselves knows that they have that spec knowledge. Like maybe you're a very, very good IR person, but you're in a novice room and those novices don't know IR, and you're like, all of you suck because all of you didn't give the right facts. You can't expect them to know the facts because they're not you. So try not to do that. And the second thing is, obviously, if you think emotion is one-sided or biased towards a side, try not to think that way, because what ends up happening is that you will lean yourself towards thinking. So you want to make sure you get out of that echo chamber. Okay. Thirdly is being able to logically follow and analyze a debate and being able to assess things, complex concepts when explained. Things like spec knowledge, things like possibly jargon that you may not know. So if a team wants to bring specialized knowledge in the debate, as I explained before, technically you're not expected to know what these details are. The debaters have a burden to explain what this is to you. Like they sort of have to describe and define what it is to you. That is sort of, because as an average reasonable voter, maybe you know what quantitative easing is because you're an econ student. But when you hop into a debate, you kind of have to assume that you don't know what it is. Because that's just like, because it shouldn't really be a good culture for debaters to throw in random jargon like epistemic access or ubiquitous and expect the judge to understand. Because sure, you might understand, but more often than not, if it is a complex concept or a complex topic, you should sort of understand that the team does have an expectation to evaluate, explain to you what that means, etc. And also when it comes to following and analyzing the debate, that's just a note on track the round, and I'll get to that a bit later. Finally, the judge's goal is very simple. You are assessing whether or not teams was able to persuade you whether or not a motion or a policy was a good or bad idea. And they can use a variety of different ways. They can use wit, they can use humor, they can use mechanisms, they can use rhetoric. But the idea of it is whether or not they were able to prove whether or not this motion was a good or bad idea. This is the very basic fundamental of the average reasonable voter. The bottom line to all of this is that A, you're just a broad, you know about the world, but you don't know deep facts, and you shouldn't use facts that you know. You shouldn't use your ideological beliefs, your personal beliefs about a topic to decide your vote. Then you should always be open to being persuaded. I don't ever think that a debate is purely lost. I don't ever think every debate is a lost hope. There's always a way can win a debate if the emotion is good enough. And you should always be open to understanding that both sides are equally valid. Just because someone is explaining to you in a better way doesn't mean that they could also the other side could also be explaining it in a equally better way. And of course, you should be expecting teams to explain complicated things to you that even if you do know, there is sort of an expectation for teams to tell you what these means. That's why we have mechanisms. You don't just accept things for what they are. And that's why point number 3 exists. You should never accept things just as they are just because they are claimed. That's called an assertion. And finally, for the whole goal and objective of this is that teams need to prove to you things that tell you whether or not something is a good or bad idea. And that's sort of what you are assessing. Okay. Persuasiveness is the main game of judging because you are, and obviously the main game of debating as a whole. You judge a debate by assessing without prejudice which team was the most persuasive in relation in whether or not they were able to convince you whether this motion was a good or bad idea. They do this by giving reasons. They give arguments, and these arguments have reasons behind them that are offered to show whether or not the argument is either true or important or relevant. We call this analysis. We can call it content. You can call it matter. You can call it mechanisms, etc. And these are often packaged under clarity and rhetorical power, in which these reasons are explained. Things like the style or the manner of a speaker. In debating in general, I know it says BP, but it also applies to AP. Analysis and style are not separate things. So I know we have a tendency to sort of hear like a speaker who speaks very nice, like a public speaker, has really nice structure, and that intuitively sounds persuasive because it just sounds good, but it should never be a metric for you to realize, oh, wow, they sound nice, I'm going to give them the win. Just because someone sounds nice, you should probably look at the things they're saying and look at whether or not they make sense. But at the same time, pure cold-hearted analysis may not be the only way to win, though I think we have shifted in a meta where that's been a bit more acceptable. But at the same time, I think in debating specifically, there's nothing persuasive in speaking a sentence clearly and powerfully if there's no reason behind that statement. And I think often and not when you judge novices or schoolies who are starting out, they usually prioritize very stylistic speeches, which is fine, they're starting out. Well, that sounds nice. Always understand that maybe everything they're saying is asserted, and the whole point of it is to check whether or not X is asserted or not. But at the same time, if a speaker has terrible style and you can't understand what they're saying, even if the reasons they're giving are true, that's probably justified a slight speaks tank because it was not presented in a way which was clear. Maybe certain pieces of analysis was just something you couldn't make out, etc. The whole bottom line around the point of persuasiveness here is persuasiveness is just the reasons is being given to behind whether or not an argument is true and whether or not this argument wins a specific issue in the round, and whether or not and how that issue ties into whether or not it convinced you that a motion was supposed to be proved or not, like approved or not approved, things like that. And their style, obviously, which sort of packages analysis in a way which sounds nice, but should never be the overriding metric to which you decide a team to win. So even if a team sounds really nice, they give all these very, very flowery words, they like sound very like they have like a very good grasp of the English vocabulary, doesn't mean you should always give them the win, because sometimes the things they could be saying are just pure, they're just saying nonsense. They're just saying nonsense stuff that could generally happen. Okay, let's get into how you actually judge. So the first and most important step in judging is just tracking. Tracking is the most important thing in debate, in judging. If you don't track, then you're not going to judge well. Trust me. But there's a balance to how you track. The way you want to track here is that you don't want to mindlessly write down every single thing that the team is saying. Because more often than not, if you only write down without thinking about whether or not a thing is proven, then you're going to have a hard time in the judging process. You need to understand what teams are trying to say. What is the premise behind the team's argument? What are the reasons they've given? And you need to sort of always sanity check yourself. When you're tracking, you need to sort of put a note in your mind or put a note in your paper or in your tracking documents. Has this thing been proven? Or is there a missing link they've probably done here? But the whole idea is that even if you don't have that intuition to think fast about whether or not a claim has been proven, it's still very important that you prioritize tracking. Workshop. Okay. So it's still very important that you prioritize tracking. Secondly, never step in the debate. I think a lot of novice judges make this mistake where they fill in a missing gap or a missing link. Like maybe a team gives 5 really good impacts, but they don't prove the impacts. But because you thought the impacts were important, you just credited the impacts as it is without evaluating whether or not it was proven because you thought they were important. Part of being an objective judge is assessing whether or not a certain argument was proven to be true, or whether or not an argument met a particular metric, whether or not it was proven to be important, whether it was also proven to be relevant, etc. And things like that. So don't step in the debate. More often than not, the way you find out, or the way you sort of stop yourself from stepping in, is you're not trying to analytically say things which weren't said in the debate. And I think the best way to think about it is like when you're assessing a claim, are you justifying it in a way with words or phrases or premises or analysis that wasn't used in a round? More often than not, the way you're justifying a claim was by saying, oh, so a team has X impacts, and I thought they are clearly pretty cool, important impacts because of XYZ reasons. But if those XYZ reasons are reasons which aren't rooted within the round, then you're probably stepping in. There are a lot of other ways to understand, but I think the way you find out whether or not you're stepping in is something that builds up over experience. But the very basic way to think about it is, if the way you're justifying a claim or the way you're assessing the premise is by using reasons that were not present within the round, or by using reasons that generally could not be derivative of how the round happened, then you are probably stepping in. Thirdly, and I think this is part of the whole average reasonable voter principle, you don't dismiss an argument just because you have a personal disagreement with it. I absolutely despise it in IR motions when a debater gets so many facts about the ASEAN region wrong. And I've judged a lot of rounds in which that has happened, where I just have like a random schoolie saying Malaysia is for some reason a really corrupt country. Like, yeah, we're corrupt, but we're not that corrupt. Like, we don't have a dysfunctional government. Or someone says Malaysia is so poor, like we need desperate things. And I'm like, that's not true. No. Or someone says, oh, Malaysia is a big US ally. They love the US so much. And I'm like, no, that's also not true. And you will come across this a lot. Like, maybe a team completely butchers the explanation of an economic concept. And you're like, yeah. Does this mean you should automatically discredit the argument, even if you obviously know it's wrong? There's a bit of a dilemma behind here. Because to some extent, if a team was able to give plausible reasons to why a claim that was obviously wrong to be true, I think you have a job to sort of try and assess it for what it is. So, for example, if a team gave me 5 mechanisms to prove the claim that Malaysia is a poor country, I kind of have no choice but to be like, you're wrong, but you did prove it. Like, and that's sort of the game of debating, right? Like, we are often saying, pulling things that we probably don't even know are true. And I'm a victim of this when I debate. I often say things which I obviously know are wrong, but I'm using stock reasons to prove whether or not a claim is true. Okay, but back to the point here. The idea behind the basics here is that, and like this is sort of part of the average reasonable voter thing, step out of that bubble of your personal beliefs and what you know is objective truth, or what is objective to you, or what is a subjective importance to you. You need to step in a position where you are willing to accept a claim to be true, even if you do not like that claim, or even if you know that claim is wrong in the real world. In debating, you're going to counter this a lot. Teams are going to say things in which you're just like, that is wrong and weird, and or some of the things, but you have to sort of step out of that bubble and be like, okay, they made this claim, did they prove it or not? And that's always the question you should be asking yourself. Don't dismiss the thing because you don't like it. Dismiss the thing if it hasn't been proven. Arguments are persuasive and impactful if they are substantiated. They become less persuasive if they are either contradicted internally, if they are responded well, or they're just simply not proven. Right. Final note, and this is the most important thing aside from tracking and like being not stepping in, always keep track of engagement. I think a lot of judges fail in terms of assessing engagement, which is fine, because assessing the way that teams interact with each other through direct rebuttal, or like the way they interact, can be something that is a bit difficult to catch. So you should always try and track. But the idea behind rebuttal is that rebuttal has a purpose. It seeks to mitigate the importance, or it seeks to directly contend with the persuasiveness of another team's case, whether or not they prove it to not be true, whether or not they prove it to be less important. Rebuttal is always existing within a spectrum. Sometimes a rebuttal is very destructive, but sometimes a rebuttal is just mitigation, and sometimes a rebuttal is probably just not a good rebuttal at all. And to some extent, you always have to consider whether or not an argument was fully proven, either fully disproven or partially disproven, and what effect does it have within a debate. So if a team, 50%, if a team has a rebuttal that like destroys the point by 50% of the extent to which it was initially claimed, how are you going to view that argument within the round? What is the way you're going to sort of assess that? And I'll get to that a bit later in the sort of like media. Clashes, the most important part of AP judging. This isn't a BP judging workshop, so you don't have. So if you came here to judge BP, I would suggest you go to my YouTube channel, because the BP one has the YouTube one. But this is for AP. Clashes are the most important part in AP judging, and I think within the Indian circuit, because you guys do Asian Parliamentary a lot, you are very, very well familiar with clashes, because this is the very basic bare bone structure of literally any whip and reply speech. Like any whip and reply speech, you're taught do clashes in whip in reply. So if you know what clashes are, good. And if you're judging, you basically kind of are doing what a whip speaker is doing, just in a more middle ground. For those who still don't know clashes, here's the explanation. When two teams argue an emotion, they often have a core point of disagreement that becomes framed as a contention or an issue within the realm, a point of disagreement. And this point of disagreement is usually framed as a question that becomes important to resolve whether or not it proves whether or not emotion is important. A very basic example of the most basic clash is, let's take a motion. This house believes that this house would ban Zeus. Off the top of the bat, what teams are going to disagree and argue about is whether or not banning Zeus or leaving Zeus. So banning Zeus is the government side, and leaving Zeus to be open is the opposition side. The contention in that round and the clash is going to be which side was able to better protect animals. Because that's what debate is obviously going to be about, right? It's obviously about protecting animals. Another very simple clash could be this house would actually, let's not do a specific motion. Let's just say this house would pursue policy X over policy Y. And it's a government policy thing. I think the most obvious clash that could be behind that is which side was able to give better economic benefits, or which side was able to give better welfare benefits to people on the ground, if that's what the debate is, what the policy is about. Which side has greater resources to implement a specific policy. Yeah, so you get a broad idea, right? If clashes are just points of disagreement within the debate, and the thing to note about clashes is that they can usually include multiple lines of argumentation, or even two arguments can fit under one clash. And often clashes have sub-clashes between them. Like there are different sub-questions you have to answer to resolve one big question. So let's say, back to the zoo example, which side better protects zoos? I think the first sub-question behind that is whether or not this ban will be effective. Because for you to believe that zoo animals would be protected, you first need to evaluate whether or not the policy would work. Because if the policy works, then it means that animals might get protected. But if the policy doesn't work, that means the animals might not get screwed over and things like that. So there are the themes, like clashes or themes or issues can have tiers behind them, where the main clash has different sub-clashes that then decide the outcome of the main clash. And sometimes you'll come into complicated situations where team golf may win one sub-clash, but team op may win another sub-clash. And then it's like, oh god, I have to resolve the main clash because there's two sub-clashes are resolved in that. Yeah. You need to have clashes to judge AP because you can't judge debates in a vacuum. You can't just compare arguments to one another. In BP, it's a slightly different ballgame, but we're not talking about BP, so it's not really that important. And usually it's very easy to catch clashes in the debate. Usually the whips will call it out already. Usually you can sort of call it out by the end of the first speaker exchange, what the clash of the debate is going to be about. Debates often will have multiple clashes, and it's your job to weigh who wins a clash and who wins the most important clash. There are many ways to evaluate whether or not a clash is won, and I'll get to this a bit later, but the very basic idea behind it is you evaluate the analysis given by the team underneath a clash, seeing whether or not the material is mechanized, does it have logical links, is it impacted, check if there are any rebuttals. Rebuttals can do a lot of things. They can mitigate the scale of impact, they can prove that the claims are harmful or bad or wrong, they can flip, they can give competing frameworks, they can engage in a multitude of ways, and the evaluation of a specific rebuttal or a specific way of engagement could also decide whether or not a team has won a specific clash. Because sometimes you come into a scenario where a team has good impacting, good mechanism, but the other team just has far greater rebuttal that destroys this, which means that that government team is not able to win a clash because their material has been sufficiently responded to. Okay. The final thing to note is you need to evaluate whether or not an argument is most important, but also whether or not an argument is the most proven underneath the clash, whether or not it was given the most mechanistic links, whether or not you believe the impact or the outcome that the team sets for themselves within an argument. And you also have to evaluate whether or not a clash is debate winning. And I'll get to this a bit later, because sometimes there can be multiple clashes in one debate, and these clashes function independently of each other. And as your judge, it's your job to decide whether or not clash A was more important to win than clash B. Okay, let's talk about burdens. For that, I'm gonna have a nice big sip of my water bottle. Right. So burdens are very important. Burdens are basically the burden is basically a objective that a team sets for themselves in order to tell you that an argument has been proven. So if I want to argue that banning zoos would help protect more animals, the obvious burden underneath that argument is to actually prove how animals are benefited under the banning of zoos. um, More often than not, burdens are usually implied within the motion. That's point three. But I'll just go to point one very quickly first. Usually, burdens, you come across a lot of times where teams like to burden push a specific burden that they expect an opponent to answer. But certain burdens cannot be asserted that they exist. Like, for example, let's say opposition, let's say I'm government, right? And I tell opposition, for opposition to win this debate, they have to prove to us why not banning zoos will save the world. That's not the debate, because obviously not. Like, as a government, you reasonably cannot push a very unfair burden. And as a judge, if you detect this kind of unfair burden pushing, or if you detect like a weird frame, like maybe a team sets a debate in a context that is clearly unfair, you should be knowledgeable of this and call it out, especially if the team does not give the analysis to prove that this is the correct metric or the framework of the debate. And you should, and this also specifically applies to judges. I think a lot of novice judges specifically push unfair burdens onto teams for some reason. And that usually happens because you either think that a motion is too unbalanced, which then gives you that bias, or like you just don't realize it. You just don't realize. And I think more than not, that's why you get tanked a lot, because you make it feel like another team has to do too much in order to prove that their side is even winning. Always be fair on the burdens you impose on a team for their claim to be true. So usually the basic way to think about it is, if a team says, I'm going to do argument X, the very basic way you sort of impose a burden onto them is, okay, prove it. You prove that claim to be true first, and then you prove it to be important by whether impacting, and then you tell me how it is relevant in winning the round. Don't be like, oh no, you can't just prove this claim. You also have to do X, Y, Z. Like, you also have to prove that you destroy the world. You also have to prove that like you save you do end world hunger. I think the simple way to think about point number one here is that never push an unfair burden onto a team, because it's usually just not fair. Like, you can't expect them to meet that specific burden. And even if you fall into that, just because you fail to meet a specific burden doesn't mean you automatically lose. More often than not, they will still give analysis under a specific burden. So maybe they're filling it up 50% to the required amount of analysis that they had to have. So just because it was not completed doesn't mean that they're automatically lost. It just means that they probably haven't proven it enough, and you have to evaluate holistically. Burdens are usually implied by the motion. I already gave the example now. In this one, it's like, this House will prioritize the vaccination of law-abiding citizens. Government teams seek to demonstrate that in major epidemics, the vaccination of law-abiding citizens should be prioritized. And finally, burdens are also usually set up by the analysis that teams take up for themselves, and it's usually within the argument. So, for example, if the motion is this House believes that assassination is a legitimate tool of foreign policy, the leader of op may argue that assassination is a severe breach of international law. For this argument to be relevant in the debate, there is a burden to prove that illegality matters for illegitimacy. So you need to prove the burden that illegality refers to illegitimacy for you to then prove that assassination is a severe breach of international law. I hope that makes sense. Metrics. Okay, metrics relate to the kinds of way in which you decide to what criteria do you determine whether or not a team has won a specific clash. And metrics can often be things like the common buzzwords you hear, like vulnerability or scale or magnitude, but it can also be a bit more nuanced to what the clash is, or who saves more people, or who gives people a better life, things like that. And they're usually the framework or the criteria that is determined by the teams to decide whether or not a policy is a good or bad idea. How do you decide whether or not you should use a specific metric? The easiest way around it is, usually in a debate, certain teams will just already explicitly agree that if it's already trade important, so maybe they agree that the goal is to save the most number of lives. If it's not explicitly agreed upon by both teams, then it is done. Then it's the implicit metric. So maybe they don't explicitly say that they want to save the most life, but the analysis and the impact points to we save lives and people die, and the impact is the metric is probably okay. This team wants to save lives. The Dikash is about saving lives. If there is not an agreement, whether explicit or implicit, then you follow the which team has proven their metric to be the most important. So more often than not, maybe it could be a battle between prioritizing social welfare or economic benefit. And your job as a judge is to, okay, which of these two metrics are more important than the other? Has a team, or is a team able to weigh to me why this X is more important than Y? Yeah. Finally, if they don't weigh which metric is more important, then you can step in and decide, as an average voter, I believe this to be true for XYZ reasons. You still have to justify it, of course. Okay. Short tangent, but I think it's very important. Principles can validly win debates. They can also be more important than practicals. Utilitarian outcomes doesn't mean that it always wins the round. You should always listen to the aims of what principles are, evaluate the claims of harms and benefits in that context. Maybe it tells you sort of moral framework that as a person, you should always follow to determine whether or not a policy is good. And maybe this shapes a different burden in the round. Like maybe it pushes a much more important metric within a debate, irregardless of whether or not there are positive or negative utilitarian outcomes behind it. Like we often make moral decisions which aren't like the most utilitarian in aspect, but it doesn't mean it's an illegitimate decision. Okay. Final side improvement, and then I'll just get to I'll get to the sample A. So the best way to improve is just to go to more tournaments, right? And I think if you're going to Muntazar, what I would highly suggest, if you are a trainee or a panelist, if you're paneling under me or any of the caps, after you finish your OA, you stay in the room and you hear the other OA, and you just listen and you see how they do it. And always listen to the OAs of a chair, understand how they format their structure, their justification. Always try to get feedback. I think a very important habit that I think is very good if you're starting out judging, every time you give your OA, there's usually like a space where you ask the team any questions. Within that time, I think what you can also do is, if you guys have any feedback on my OA, I would appreciate it, as I'm just starting out judging. More often than not, if you make it explicit clear to the teams that you want feedback on your OA, they usually are happy to give it to you. And this is how I improved as a judge a lot. I just ask teams, could you give feedback on my OA? You can Discord message them, you can like ask them, hey, I would be the one judge who would approach a team to get feedback on my OA. And I think this helps a lot. Watch other judging workshops. I think the best judging workshop for AP that I've ever watched, that I also had referred from, is Pranav Kagalkar's Master the Art of OA and Judging workshop under UADC 2023. I can send a link to that a bit later. I think it's the greatest AP judging workshop of all time. It helped me a lot when in UADC specifically. Finally, debate more. I think if you debate more, you understand the game a bit better, and it's sort of a symbiotic relationship where the more you judge, the more you understand debating, but also the more you debate, the more you understand judging. You can do both at the same time, and you should try to do both at the same time. Both paths are are viable career paths. So I am a career judge, but I debate on the side because I like debating, and I think getting better at judging has gotten me better at debating. Yeah. And good debates need good judges who know how to assess them, and you'll also be able to give good feedback. But at the same time, you'll be able to give better feedback if you debate more, because you get to know more cases, etc. Okay, I know it says thank you, but it's not over yet. I'm gonna give a sample OA. Give me a second to just switch my slide. So what we're gonna do next is I'm just gonna share a UADC run that I judged. So this was round 8 of UADC 2024. It was a pretty good room actually. This was Democratic Party is US Democratic Party. I think it just means the Democrats, so Biden's party. So I'll just go over what the team said, and then I'll just go into my notes and how I would have it delivered in OA. So within the debate, Prime Minister comes up and says that, hey, the the interest of the Democratic Party is electoral power. Currently, they aren't strong because they want Israel to benefit. They want to be benefited of Israel. Um, don't mind the swear words because I track in a very weird way. But basically, the argument they ran is just that you get more voters because you appeal to people who are calling out the genocide, and this is in the interest because you are a principally ideological freedom of speech person, and you call out genocide. That's good for you. Also, yeah, sorry, I like to drink a lot when I give workshops because my throat dries up easily. Opposition comes up and says, actually, votes will not happen because the Democratic Party has already like opposed the protests of oppressed. It's opposed. So they've been standing against like pro-Palestinian stuff, and backlash is going to occur because people will think Biden as a hypocrite. Remember, they launched a separate argument on investment. Things like Israel gives the Democrats money. If you speak out against Israel, you lose money. That's the basic argument. And then the debate kind of just revolves around votes, what is the interest, investment, and then there's an extension on geopolitical influence, and then sort of, yeah. Before I get onto the OA, let's just do a very quick exercise here. Based on what happened, based on the very basic like stuff that you heard I say about the debate, what do you guys think were the clashes within this round? You can just type it in the chat. And you can frame the clash in whatever way. You can frame it as a question, you can frame it as whatever. But what do you guys think like were the clashes within this specific debate that I just showed? I'll give like 1 minute. All right, there's one. All right, that's the same one. Emotionally appeal versus monetarily. I'm not sure what that one means, but could possibly be. Okay. Emotionally appealing to the voters versus monetary. Yeah, okay, got it. Myopic versus hypometropic standpoint. I don't know what that means. I'm so sorry. I am an ESL speaker. I don't know what myopic and hypermetropic means. I'm so sorry. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's valid. Anything else? Okay, I'm gonna share back my screen. So yeah, so all of these are correct. These are actually very valid clashes for the debate. So here's how I decided the OA. I'm really not gonna go through the tracks. Okay. So funnily enough, the first clash that I did identify in this debate, and the reason I identified this clash was specifically what is the interest of the Democratic Party? Why did I identify this clash in the round? Very simple. I think from the get-go, government tells me that they want electoral power. They want to support this. And they also give an implicit claim in the impact here that they want to uphold the ideological rights. So off the top of the PM speech, I'm sort of aware that the interest of the US Democratic Party is more electors, more voters, and also some degree of ideological interest. The way that opposition comes up to contend this is by saying that, no, actually, what is within your interest is the extent of probably money you get, or probably like the cooperation that you want, or, you know, the kind of voters that you go through. So Gov says that they're democratic in nature. Op says, actually, no, they're kind of conservative, and you want to win the votes of swing states. This comes out in a dialogue where they say, actually, voters you don't really give a shot about majority voters. You actually care more about swing states. So you want moderate states. So you only care about these states, and even if there is popular vote about the issue, because most people on the ground think that like they want to stop the conflict. The problem is that Gov needs to prove why the people on the ground care more about this to win the election. So like the clash in this is within the interest. Is it whether or not are you democratic and you are like ideological, or whether or not you just care about swing states? So how do I then weigh this? So I think the way that I sort of weigh this, I think the comment I initially made here is that government does prove and explain that there is a huge degree of support on the ground, and this may be within the interest of the Democratic Party in the sense where it is a big public perception, but opposition points out that this may not be the most relevant thing in the round, because even if there is an alignment of views, government needs to prove why the party wants to pander to this. However, I think like opposition, but our opposition doesn't really respond to boycotts, and I think government at some point in their speech do point out boycotts. So how do I weigh this? Firstly, what is the most proximate interest to pander towards to? The way I evaluate this is to suggest that even if the characterization of government is correct, that you are like a very human rights focused person and you want to appeal to the people on the ground, opposition is able to counter characterize this by saying that firstly, the Democratic Party does still support Israel regardless of their quote unquote humanitarian principles. And secondly, even if it is true that even if it is true that the voters are important, opposition is able to counter this by saying that swing states is what decides elections, and most of northern and north, the Democratic Party prioritizes this. And the final point here is to suggest that, like the final point of weighing here is that even if it is true that there are boycotts existing under the Democratic government, which may lose the stability, I think government just does not prove the extent to which this is the most harmful outcome, given that opposition explains that there are other harmful outcomes that could occur at a point in which you sort of sacrifice, like at a point in which you sort of like already show that you are very much within the interest of this actor, very much in line with very much politically in line with Israel through a lot of other reasons, and also in line with the sense where you're already willing to shut down basic humanitarian rights, etc. So the end result is, even if it's true that government explains the value of this party is sort of democratic, in line with them, they care about people, this is still something that's principally inconsistent. Opposition proves that. Okay. Actual clash in the round. Voters. This one was probably the biggest one in the debate, and hinted at the first clash with the swing state stuff. Gov basically says a lot of people support genocide. Like, no. A lot of people support not genocide. Please don't take what I said out of context. That was terrible. A lot of people hate genocide. They would like the Democratic Party to not endorse this. Yeah. So at the point in which that is true, you get voters, and you call this out. Government is correct. So the way I evaluated this is that government is correct, but the missing burden here is, why does the US Democratic government care about this more compared to what opposition says? Because opposition says that you need to win the election, and you need to win the election by catering to swing states, because the electoral system functions by winning specific states over winning simple majority vote. So there's now a different clashing mechanism of how we get voters. Is it through pure public support, or whether through be winning swing states? And government has some other ways of mitigating this by saying that, again, the boycott stuff, and again, your reputation is pretty bad. I think the weighing here that I used is, even if it is true that government is able to prove to me that there's huge majority interest and huge people really want the Democratic Party to take a stand and push for harsher stand against Israel for what they are doing. And it's not clear to the extent that this guarantees them to win the election, because it just proves that you get popular support. But given that opposition is able to counterframe that the way you win elections is not just through majority vote, it is through the way you cater to your own party's interest, and the way you sort of you could possibly lose the election is probably something that's pretty important. So if you lose the election by losing swing states, then you're probably screwed over. Finally, investment. I think this was a very obvious opposition win because government does not prove or respond to this. The only thing that we get from government is that you get boycotted and you lose public hegemony. You lose a lot of like global hegemony. What opposition is able to impact here is within the argument of investment, where they say that there's a lot of Israeli actors who give the Democratic Party a lot of lobbying, a lot of funding, and that's probably very, very important to you. Um, so even if government might be correct that the boycotts have losing you a lot of money, they don't specifically prove what the tipping point here is. I think opposition's tipping point is far more important because they say that if you lose the support of these lobbyists, then they end up supporting the Republican Party, which is probably far worse off to you. So, they might lobby your opponents instead. And I think the weighing underneath this is firstly, opposition is able to tell me that they have a huge degree of maintaining monetary benefit. And also, secondly, there's a huge opportunity cost here that they lose at a point, and they don't want to lose that. So maybe you do get boycott to some extent and you lose some influence, but government needs to prove to me why this is the most important harm in the debate. Opposition has a far larger harm that exists within the round. All right. I hope that was like a decent representation of like how I go through my notes. I'm just going to go through another example, and this time I'll just give like an actual live OA, because I think what I just wanted to show you there was just my thought process and the way I go through judging as a whole. So let's just go through a different UADC round. Okay. Let's do this one. Round 5. Okay. Let's also revise history curricula to emphasize reproductive labor. Reproductive labor is work sustained to human life. Babysitters, domestic helpers, people, etc. My note structure is slightly different because I was experimenting. Don't mind that. So, Gov basically argued that currently schools don't teach this. Schools don't emphasize reproductive labor, and this is bad because it deprioritizes the importance of domestic labor, and you need to be able to give the people who go to these jobs things like proper more pay, and also teach kids to talk to their maids, to talk to their mothers, and get proper discourse to avoid things like exploitation within these workforce. And then they also they also tried to prove a principle here that this is just something that like they deserve some sort of recognition because it is a proper recompensation of what they've done. The very fact that they haven't been able to give this is probably something that's a bad thing. Yeah. So the way that opposition comes here is to say that this is not going to work because you will sacrifice parts of the curricula. So opposition's case here is, firstly, you will revise the curricula too much and basically commit educational revisionism. Secondly, it's difficult to do this because it makes the education system feel too heavily weighed onto like trying to just cater to like women, etc. And then they try to mitigate the whole point of discourse and children opting in by saying that there is a gap between student kids and reproductive workers. Kids are often very bad, and they say history is boring. Okay, I'm going to pretend that I was giving an OA. Okay. So, I'm just water. So, oddly enough, a lot of the debate happened around the feminist movement. Like government, sort of the way that government tries to do this is by saying that this is important for women specifically because these jobs are often decided by women, and the feminist movement needs to do this, which is why I named the clash. Which kind of education is going to be good for the feminist movement? None. 3, 2, 1. Clash 1. Which kind of education is going to be good for the feminist movement? The way that government comes into this clash is to explain to me that people are not aware of the importance of reproductive labor, and therefore they are not taken as seriously. So the impact and they also claim that the representation of these roles are often misrepresented because of things like priority towards like the patriarchy and just general antagonism. I think the way they're able to impact this claim is by suggesting to me that there's a constant abuse that happens towards reproductive labor workers, and B, there's a lack of visibility that these workers have, which obviously harms them. I think the reason I credit fully as of this point in the debate is because they're able to prove to me that there's a lack of representation of within these labor, and a lot of these are women. And they also explain to me that the mindset behind these people is so drilled in because of the fact that they are just so neglected, which means that discrimination happens quite a lot. How does opposition respond to this? The first way they respond to this, and the main way they respond to this, is to suggest to me that history is not a good way to it is probably not a good idea to revise the education syllabus to fit in this particular syllabus. And they impact this by trying to say that people are going to backlash because they feel like you are promoting the wrong ideas of the feminist movement. They feel like this is outdated. And they think that it's like they will be also mad because they will shift the entire historical curriculum to cater to this narrative. And this takes away actual important education. Therefore, this is a legitimate shift. Why does opposition still lose? The first problem with opposition is that, like, their claim here is to try to suggest to me that, okay, hold on, I just realized, okay, I'm just gonna make this up. I think the first problem with opposition is that the problem with their claim here is that they don't specifically prove why is it that the shift in the education is going to be so dramatic, because they just claim an outcome might happen, but they don't give the analysis required to prove that the education system would change this way. So the harm that they want to push here is not something that I can reasonably believe to be true, because they just don't prove it. But even if I did believe it to be true, there are still a few missing things to note here. The first thing to note here is that even if it is true that you shift the curriculum in a way that causes backlash to occur in a way that is so bad, I think it doesn't take away the harm that Goff claims here, which is to say that there's an often harmful misrepresentation and abuse that a lot of these women in these jobs have to go through. Given that's the case, that Goff sets this up as an important metric in the debate, even if I were to believe that opposition proves to me that backlash might occur, given that they don't specifically prove to what extent this backlash occurs, because they don't give the mechanisms required to prove to me that the education system would change it to this extent, they also just don't tell me why they fix the original problem in the debate, which is how are we able to help these women far better off, right? And at the point in which that's the case, I think opposition just isn't able to sort of like take that. Yeah, sorry about that. Same thing. And I think like that's very basic OA. I just realized I didn't get the notes to my OA, so I'm just not gonna like go through that. Not the fullest OA, but that's just how I would sort of like present it. Okay. Let's get on to questions. I hope that was clear. So the way I sort of packaged and positioned the OA was, firstly, I summarize what the team said, and then I think about how did the other team engage, and then the way I weigh is just, team A makes this response, but they don't recognize this response properly. That's probably not something that I can credit them for, but even if it was true, there's this other impact from the other team that's left standing, and that's something that probably still stays. Sorry, lots of alternative reasonings you can give to sort of imply whether or not a clash was won, but that's sort of like the basic structure. Often more than not, you will figure it out as you go along when you debate, when you judge more, but that's sort of the broad structure I would give. Now I'm going to get on to answering the questions that were given. And then if you want to shoot questions in the Google Meet, you can also do that. How to choose metrics for crediting an argument and weighing clashes. I think I already covered this in the workshop. Firstly, you sort of look at whether or not teams explicitly agree whether or not this metric is more important. Then you decide. And then if it's not explicitly made clear, then you look at whether it's implicitly made clear. whether or not the impact of a team, if both impacts of a team is saving lives or lives are ruined, then probably the claim is like, yeah, life there. So when is a clash considered a wash? A clash is considered a wash if you are just genuinely unable to resolve to what extent was the team able to win or to prove whether or not their impact is more important, or like let's say there's a mechanistic deadlock and you just have no way of resolving it because there's just no delta that happens. So if a clash is considered a wash, if there's just reasonably no difference that happens in both sides, like maybe team X has like some degree of change, but team also has a similar degree of change that goes both ways, but it doesn't go to the next level. So it's just the same thing, and you reasonably cannot be, and because of the fact you can credit both of these things to be true at the same time, no one's just able to win on that. Okay, I'm gonna go to the team. What do you do if a team presents a frame that is weird or uncharitable, but the other team goes along with it? Then you have to judge the debate for what it is. Like you just have to judge the debate for what it is. If op goes along with it, then they go along with it. You judge the debate as it happened. You can give a feedback to opposition by saying that you probably shouldn't have followed along with it. You should have challenged it. But you should judge the debate as it happened. How do you analyze burdens, and when is it appropriate to give your own weighing to justify without entering the debate? The first way you analyze burdens is to sort of, I think, in terms of identifying burdens, it comes in two ways. It comes in the way in which it is implied by the motion, or the way it is implied by the argument that the team is giving. So, for example, in the workshop I gave about the whole this house believes that assassination is a legitimate tool of foreign policy, and opposition says that assassination being illegal means that assassination is illegal, therefore no. They have to prove why illegality matters in terms of assessing whether or not something is legitimate in foreign policy. So that's like the way you analyze a burden. I think the way you think about burdens is there a specific contingency for a specific claim to be true? Like, each argument has an underlying premise that requires that premise to be true for everything else to fall through. So if I want to say that we need to protect human agency, the underlying premise behind that is, why is human agency so important to protect? Because if I give a lot of flowery stuff by saying, oh my God, human agency, we need to protect it because it gives humans a sort of reclamation over their autonomy, all these nice flowery words. But I could probably, the impacts sound good, right? But why is agency important? That's the question behind burdens, analyzing burdens. The very simple way to think about it is, whenever a team has an argument, there's always an underlying premise or an underlying assumption that is required to be true, and you are assessing whether or not that underlying assumption was something that was proven or asserted. If they don't do that, then probably the argument falls apart, or maybe it reduces the, yeah. How do you judge teams that just list constructive, but they don't provide impact, weighing, or don't engage? Yeah, classic, happens in novice rooms all the time. I know what it means. This is also, very funnily enough, the fourth question I got. How do you judge below average teams? This might take a while, because I actually have a structure behind this. I think the first way you want to think about construct teams who are novices is to give them a lower burden of proof, in terms of they are not going to probably give the, they are probably not going to give the very basic fundamental reasons to why an argument is true. They will probably just give one-liner reasons. You kind of just have to give them the benefit of the doubt and sort of be like, okay, it's like 10% of the job that was required to prove the argument, but I will just take it as it is. And then within the OA, you kind of, when you're justifying it or when you're giving the OA, you just want to be like, how much can I stretch the very few lines of analysis they give to sort of decide did they prove their impact or not? If it was to a level which was so vague, then you're just like, you just explain why it's vague. And you just honestly tell the teams that, look, you gave this analysis, it intuitively makes sense, but you only said it. I still have a lot of questions that you still don't prove. I can credit it to this extent because on intuition, it probably is true. Like that one line of analysis you gave to that one argument which had a big impact is one tool in the toolbox that you use. But yeah, so bottom line to this first point is like, take what you can get out of the team, take what you are able to, like, take what you can get and just do your best to assess it to the best of your ability, but also be honest about it. Say them, I just could not credit to this extent because it missed this specific thing, like you don't explain XYZ. Okay, so if they don't impact, then you can just say like, they don't, the team is able to tell me this, but they don't explain to me why it's important. And because they don't explain to me why it's more important, I'm just not really able to credit it to the fullest extent because it's just not impacted. If teams don't engage, and becomes a parallel debate, which more often than not it becomes a parallel debate, that's okay. It's unfortunate. It's novice teams, they'll do that. I think the most important step to do when you go into debate where teams are either they're not engaging at all or they're engaging with very simplistic one-liner rebuttal, I think the way you want to go about it is just to sort of think about whether or not a team has proven their impact to be important in a vacuum, and you want to compare those two vacuums with one another. So maybe one team is in their own little world and another team is in their own little world and they just don't interact with each other. Like, it's just a complete parallel debate. You just need to sort of, you kind of are forced to step in and justify why did you evaluate why one thing was more important than the other without them interacting. Like, that's where you sort of bring in the average reasonable voter intuition and be like, you guys don't respond to one another, but probably because Gov proved their argument just a little bit more, I'm willing to credit them more. Or maybe they don't prove it at all, but because Gov asserts something that's comparatively slightly more important, I'm willing to credit them more. Worst case scenario, usually teams give barely any lines of analysis, and you just need to sort of, it's like being a scavenger. You kind of have to be forced to be a scavenger. But yeah, that's how you try to assess like low-level rooms, novice rooms. But I think the most important step is be nice. They're novices. As much as we, as judges, we have to go to that one room that may have lost our brain cells. Teams, or especially when novices, probably don't know that. They're probably trying their best. You don't want to discourage them. Be honest, but be nice. I think that's my most important advice. Okay. How do you assess whip and reply? Okay, yeah, I have a lot to say about whips and replies. I think there's been a bad culture in AP judging and BP judging even, where whips and replies have been other credited. So I want to just clear this up. Whips and replies can and should have the ability to turn debates on their own. I have given wins purely on solo carry whips, and I have given close debates on replies. Like literally down the line, all these substantive speakers had the same dead exact score, but there was a 0.5 difference in the reply. And the reason for that is quite obvious. Whips and replies tell you, good whips and good replies tell you why is it that a specific piece of material should be prioritized? Or why do we win on a specific clash point in a strategic way? Like, they are basically commenting on a debate. And think of whips and replies as judge-to-judge communication. Like, they're kind of, think about it, right? They're kind of paneling with you. It's kind of like they're technically kind of deliberating with you in a sense, where they're telling you why you should prioritize X over Y. As a judge, the way you assess whips and replies is by listening to the reasons they give to why you should prioritize their argument over anything else in the debate. Rebuttal is rebuttal. If the rebuttal was really strong in whip, you credit that rebuttal. Like, if the solo carry whip in rebuttal was able to be made without even using any new material, they get an 8. It could be a 76, 80, and that 80 won the round. Like, honestly, that generally could happen. Very rare that it happens, because it's very, very rare. But give whips a lot of benefit of the doubt. The way you decide whether or not something is new to material or not is just to think about what's the reasons they give something that was not given within the debate before. Whips can still give new analysis, by the way. They just can't give completely new material, like material that is not derivative out of the that is material that you cannot conceivably pull out of the previous two speeches. New analysis could just be entirely new rebuttal. Like, sure, it's not suggested. Strategically, it's bad if you have the destructive rebuttal in whip. But at the same time, you kind of still have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And reply speakers, same concept, right? They do all the key-weighing, they do all the key comparison, they tell you what is the most important outcome of the debate. Give them that benefit of the doubt. Okay, how do you structure the OA? Okay, so okay, listen very closely. In Muntazar specifically, in any AP competition, I want you guys to prioritize the very basic format of 1 to 2 minutes. Please keep your general feedback short. 1 to 2 minutes is enough. I hate it when judges give 5 minutes of general feedback. Remember, your general feedback counts for the time you give your OA as well. So if you're done with 2 minutes of general feedback, that's 8 minutes left for you to give your OA, which is not ideal. I usually always keep general feedback between 1 minute. If it's a novice room, I'd probably be a bit longer because I don't have much to say in the OA, but keep your general feedback. Likely of which to call, like that's obvious. For me, actually, I do the opposite, but I don't think there's a imperative in giving the call first and then general feedback. I've always given the call first and then general feedback because that's just my style. I don't like making debaters wait. You can do general feedback first and call. There isn't an objective correct way. I know most Indian judges and every single AP judge I know does general feedback first and then call, with some minorities like the minority like me who does the call first and then general feedback. But it's really not that deep. You can do either way. They will get the call either way. It doesn't really matter. OA, clash one. What does Gov say? What does Op say? Observations you made that may lead you to not credit certain claim. And then finally, justifying the clashes. Like, what was the evaluation of this material over this material? Were these responses enough? Did the team prove this thing? How was the team's weighing? And then you sort of rub it down, like conclude nicely. So bottom line, this team wins this clash because you're able to do this, opt this, and do this. How do you not track? Depends on you. I track in a very specific way that works for me. You should find a way which works for you. I track on Docs. Some people track in Google Sheets. Some people track in OneNote. Some people use paper. There is no correct way to track. There is only tracking which is good for you. What you like to do. Miscellaneous stuff. Should constructors be part of the OA or personal feedback? Very broad general feedback you can keep to 1 to 2 minutes. Can be in the OA, it helps a lot. Personal feedback is where all the deep stuff comes. What should you do to prepare for a tournament aside from judging mocks? Watch judge workshops, actually. I think that's another good advice I can give. And something I like doing when I was practicing for UADC is I would watch very good AP recordings and I would just record an OA out of that. Sorry about this. I'm like, I don't know. I think I'm a bit sick right now. Okay. How do you deliver close calls? Close calls are like very tough, and I think the way you think about close calls is what is the one small line of analysis or the one implied piece of impact, or just think about the one small thing that may turn the tide just a small bit. I think that's the easiest way I can say it. It's always about the one small thing in a debate, especially if everything is close. Because if the rigor of analysis and the amount of content that is delivered in one clash was so large, it is usually decided on a very slims, on a very on the edges of the margins, etc. So that's how you start to think about it. What should you keep in mind when giving speaks? Don't tank too low without. I just don't tank. I think only tank when you generally think it's deserved. Look at the score. The range is there for a reason. And finally, and this is the advice I give to anyone who's new to speaks, the top speaker of UADC at best only gets an 80.5-ish average. The very average speech in any UADC, which is the pinnacle of AP debating, obviously, is a 75. So the most average AP speech is a 75. Operate within that expectation. Is it strategic to dismiss main pushes in office room cases their burdens are fulfilled? Again, as I said just now, right? Even if a burden isn't fulfilled, it doesn't mean that the team has automatically lost. You should assess what was given and use that analysis to the best of your ability. Or should we still, yeah, so try to compare them speculatively to prove they won't work. Like, just take it to the best that you can. Right. That's the Q&A done. That is all the like the live way done. And there any other questions? Otherwise, I think we can end the workshop here. Okay. How much does the relevance of answers into a POI? If the POI answer, so POIs are just ways for teams to engage with each other. Like, is it a rebuttal? Is it a weighing? The way you think about how the answers to POI factor into the adjudication process is is it in another piece of analysis that you factor in to decide a clash? Because usually POI engagement helps, is another tool in the toolbox to resolve clashes. If the answer that they give is I don't know, or like they give a they give a wrong answer, the question in itself is like it's a lingering question in the back of your mind that you should keep in track. Like, you can bring it in your OA, like, and this is another thing that's important about this. Like, maybe the example, like, nothing but important about this clash is Gulf gives this POI to engage with his team, and Op doesn't resolve it correctly, and that's another thing to note. So, if the answer is irrelevant, but the POI itself is important, then you assess it within the debate. I hope that makes sense. Any other questions? Oh. Simple questions. Which side is able to win? Which side is able to benefit the economy? Which side protects people the most? Which side achieves better efficacy underneath this policy? Which side wins the war? That's the easiest way to name clashes. I have always just named my clashes the easiest way possible. You don't have to make it so deep. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, there's nothing by the end of the, hold on, if my time zone conversion is correct. 8:54, 8:24. Yeah, there's nothing by 8:30. I think we can just end the workshop. Sorry, I was doing some math to think about IST.
Right. I think if there are no more doubts, we can definitely end the workshop. Firstly, thank you so much, Imran, for joining us today, especially the OA's part, like where you literally gave us two demo OA. And also, like, I think we can share the slides if that's possible. If you could share the slides
Yeah,
on the WhatsApp group.
I think I gave the slides to one of the OC members too.
Correct. Perfect.
Right.
Great, then. Thank you so much, Imran. Thank you so much for your time. It's literally like almost been around 1.5 hour now. And yes, also thank you everyone for joining in. I hope all your doubts got cleared, and I hope if you're participating at Muntazar, you will be judging the teams well and also getting good scores. As for the slides, we'll share that shortly on the group itself, and as well as the recording once we've like turned it into a Google Drive link or something like that. Other than that, if you haven't already registered, we're still taking registration for independent judge slots. And as for the team slots, you can register on the form itself and we'll add you to the wait list. And if any slot frees up, we will reach out to you personally. That being said, thank you so much again. Thank you so much. You can now leave the call.
Bye bye. Thank you, guys.